Hi, everyone. Welcome to a Whiskey Advocate tasting. Today it's bourbon time, and I'm really lucky to share this with you. We've got two great brands, Old Tub, Old Overholt, Beam Suntory, bringing out the big guns. My name is Keith Goldston. I am the corporate master sommelier for Landry's. We got a few restaurants that have a little bit of bourbon, so, place where you can get your bourbon time on, maybe at a Morton's, a Mastro's, Del Frisco's, Palms. How do you wrap up a great big steak dinner? With some whiskey, and especially bourbon time. So sit back, get ready to enjoy. We've got some great stuff for you. I'm very lucky to be joined today by Travis Hinkle, the beverage director for the magnificent, spectacular Post Oak Hotel in Houston. Travis, welcome to Bourbon Time.
Thanks, Keith. Really thrilled to be here.
Yeah, did we not know? What a nice surprise that it is bourbon time. You and I are both pretty big fans of enjoying the brown spirit whenever we can, even though, wine is work. I personally kind of feel whiskey and bourbon is that wonderful kind of reprieve, and it makes wine better. What's your thoughts on bourbon, whiskey, and what's your bourbon time?
I'm a huge bourbon fan and really just an American whiskey fan in general. And I like whiskey in a lot of different contexts. I'm a big believer in just sitting down on the porch on a hot day, little half glass of crushed ice, pour some high proof bourbon or rye whiskey on it, and just sipping and enjoying it that way. I love cocktails. So for me, bourbon does wonderfully, and a lot of classic American cocktails like your, of course, Old Fashioned, your Manhattan, your Sazerac, and then messing around with sort of new inventions as well. Bourbon always has a place on my bar, and I'm super happy to talk about it today.
Yeah, and that was really interesting because just hearing you say rye whiskey, bourbon, is there a difference? What is this like mash bill that we talk about? Like, why is this significant, and why should we care?
Yeah, totally. So there's a lot of confusion, but the difference is really pretty simple, right? When we're talking bourbon whiskey, we're talking about a whiskey that's being made predominantly from corn, minimum 51% corn, and then sometimes supplemented by other grains like smaller bits of rye, barley, wheat, grains like that. When we're talking rye whiskey, we're talking about a similar style of whiskey just made from minimum 51% rye. But those differences in what we call the mash bill, or the proportion of the grains being used to make this distilled spirit, really have a big impact on the final character of the whiskey.
Yeah, and it's crazy, and I love that this beverage just kind of became distinctly American, and just kind of origin of it in the U.S. is just such the immigrant kind of United States of America story, where we have settlers in Pennsylvania, Maryland, New York, Jersey, and barley, which was the grain of choice, doesn't grow well. And then rye happens to grow great that some German immigrants had brought over, and they were used to making schnapps and, stuff like that. And then you had these Irish, Scottish settlers that knew how to, make Irish and Scottish whiskeys. And this kind of fusion of working together is such a cool thing. And then the thought of using barrels and this, lots of American oak that was available, charring it, just how the flavor profile was similar, but such a dramatic quantum leap from what we were used from Scotland or, Ireland in that matter.
Yeah, and that talk about oak is really, really important. And for me, that's what really distinguishes American styles of whiskeys from more European examples of whiskeys is all rye whiskeys, all bourbon whiskey, they're going to be aged in charred, brand new American oak barrels. And that charred oak barrel is really what's giving a lot of the character and distinctive kind of profile to American whiskeys. Those are notes of vanilla, kind of toast and baking spice and caramel that really show through in American whiskeys much more than they would in, say, a Scotch whiskey or an Irish whiskey or those classic European examples.
Yeah. And then also, too, I find like the story gets almost even more the immigrant kind of U.S. story in the fact that there is taxation, rebellion, then to hell with you. Let's go over the hills to the western frontiers, which happens to be Kentucky, Tennessee, and let's start trying to plant rye. It doesn't do as well there, but corn does great. So then it makes sense to kind of switch the mash bill to mostly corn. And then you go from that kind of grassy, spicy rye flavor to now kind of the sweet corn with the sweet vanilla oak. And it just launches a style that eventually takes over a lot of the world. And thankfully we still have with us.
Yeah, absolutely. And, talk about the difference between rye and corn and wheat and all of these other grains. I like to think analogously to how those sort of grains end up when you're baking, right? You think of a good slice of rye bread, it has this sort of rustic, earthy, spicy, like you said, grassy character. Compare that with a slice of corn bread, right? Which has a sweeter profile, which has almost a texture and a kind of chew to it that's a little distinct from rye whiskeys. And for me, by thinking about it that way, you can really start to pick up some of the nuanced differences between a bourbon style of American whiskey and a rye style.
Yeah, and then kind of when I'm looking at whiskey and drinking them or shopping them, that mash bill is absolutely paramount in kind of the overall flavor profile of the spirit. But the other thing that I don't think we talk enough about is the actual proof. And it's one of those small little numbers on a label that luckily we're starting to pay a little more attention to. But the difference between like an 80 proof, 86 proof, 90, cask strength at like 114 or whatever, to me, it's almost the biggest shift in flavors out of any aspect of shopping, whether it's bourbon, rye, or any of like the corn. So Travis, what's your thoughts on proof and how does that impact the flavor for you? And especially, I know you're like an awesome mixologist. Thank you. How does it impact like your cocktails?
Well, it makes a big difference. And so for those of you watching at home, you walk into an average liquor store and you're looking at a common bottle of bourbon, say, on the shelf. Many of those are going to be bottled at 80 proof, which is just the same as 40% alcohol by volume. Those make great cocktails and they're wonderful. But one of the common threads that we're talking about today is this bottled and bond designation. And part of what that entails is all of those whiskeys are going to be bottled at 100 proof or 50% alcohol by volume. And so what that means is with that little bit of extra alcoholic strength, you have extra flavor. It basically means that less water has been added back to the whiskey after it's been aged in oak barrels. And so I love them for cocktails because of what it means is with cocktails, you're taking your base spirit, say your bourbon or your rye whiskey, you're mixing it with other ingredients and then shaking it or stirring it with ice, which is going to be chilling it down, but then also adding water back to it. And so if you're starting with a stronger spirit, even after you dilute it and chill it down with a little bit of that water, you still have a full strength cocktail that delivers a lot more flavor than your average, say, 80 proof bourbon whiskey.
Cool. Well, thank you, Travis. And speaking of bottled in bond, that sounds kind of exotic and legalese. So I think we might want to bring in a little help. We're lucky enough today to be joined with Bradford Lawrence out of Beam Suntory, who is the proud owners of Old Tub and Old Overholt, which hopefully we'll be tasting shortly. But Bradford, welcome to the tasting.
How you doing? Nice to be here.
Great. So what is, besides the 100 proof, what is this whole bottled in bond story and why does it matter?
Yeah, the bonded history is a really, really cool story. And March is a great month to be talking about the bonded history because we actually just passed the anniversary of the Bottled and Bond Act, which was March 3rd. This all starts back late 19th century. The whiskey market was really unregulated, more than you can even imagine. Just kind of set the table, like to put it all into context. Upton Sinclair published his famous book, The Jungle, in 1906. This book blew the lid off the meatpacking industry back in the day. And it wasn't until 1906 when we as a country were finally coming around to regulating our meat standards. This book was the catalyst for the Meat Inspection Act. The Bottle and Bond Act of 1897 was 9 years earlier. So as you can see, we had our priorities straight. We were getting our whiskey in line first before our meat regulation. This is a great story. It's it all, as any good story comes to fruition, it's all about rivalry, and it's definitely one for the record books. It's all about this rivalry between straight whiskey distillers and whiskey rectifiers. Rectifiers, much like non-distiller producers today, purchase distillate from other sources and age it, and then they're able to blend it and create beautiful whiskeys. Potentially, there's some tinkering of the finished product that would happen back in the past, adding flavor and coloring and bottling at varying proofs. And you will find, if you do any deep historical dives, you'll find these names like fine old bourbon. It's all basically trying to convince consumers and whiskey enthusiasts back in the day that the liquor was still good. So it's important to note that a number of rectifiers produced honest to goodness whiskey. However, it's the producers that were making that, like, really the knockoff bourbons and ryes that flooded the market. It was cheap, easy to produce, and it made it really, really difficult for straight whiskey producers to gain a foothold, and even forced a lot of them into bankruptcy. Some famous rectifiers were Paul Jones, and he started Four Roses. George Garvin Brown actually started Old Forester. And they eventually, like, bought a distillery once the Bond Act came through. So being a rectifier isn't a bad thing. It was just a different style of making whiskey.
So in some ways, you're saying this was maybe like, was it the first Consumer Protection Act in the U.S.? I mean, it's got to be close, right?
It's got to be close. I mean, I'm hard pressed to think, because it wasn't until 1906 with the Meat Inspection Act. Yeah, this was probably one of the first, if not the first, real consumer protection in that arena. It's pretty cool. It definitely went up through the courts. Bourbon producers, rye producers, they would not go down without a fight. So, there were some pretty distinct crusaders back then. Most notably, you've got Colonel E.H. Taylor Jr. He was the founder of Old Fashioned Cooper, the OFC distillery, which is now Buffalo Trace current distillery. And there's actually some lore that the ownership of Overholt at the time, which would have been Henry Clay Frick and Andrew Mellon, were possibly active in helping usher in this act as well, because they were major industry titans that had a lot of political leverage. They were also one of the first companies to adopt this legislation. Even though E.H. Taylor, like, was forced to sell OFC to George T. Stagg back in, like, I think it was 1878. He dedicated the rest of his life to the protection and production of, straight American whiskey. In particular, he joined forces with this great guy who probably doesn't get enough credit, Kentuckian John G. Carlisle. He was the Secretary of Treasury at the time. Fun fact about him, while he was Secretary of Treasury, his term actually ended March 4th of 1897. So he really wanted to see this act go through to the end. So he was clearly really believed in American whiskey.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I was just going to say, and the overall, I mean, there's definitely some minutia we can dive down to, but really it's the bottling at 100 proof, single distillery, single kind of distilling season, correct? And that's either kind of spring or fall.
Yep.
And then no blending, like you need,
mm-hmm.
and then the minimum of 4 years, correct? And then a bonded warehouse, and then the wonderful little tax loophole where you don't have to pay taxes until you bottle, correct? Or
true. Yeah, that's a really good way of kind of encapsulating kind of the general sense. There are some little bit more nuances to it. Same distiller at the same distillery. At the time, people were kind of rotating through who was distilling for whom, and it was a little bit more of an open market. So they want to make sure it was one distiller, one distillery. And you mentioned the distilling seasons. It was January to June or July to December. And this was pretty much put into place. So it forced distillers in a good way to make sure that they were using quality grain and not sitting on it too long. So it made them be like, we got to use this grain, and we can confirm that it's quality, even all the way down to the grain in the water. Like, every part of the process is you're going to have a quality spirit. Aged for 4 years. Now that's the minimum. You can have a 7-year, 10-year, 15, whatever you'd like, but it's aged 4 years under government supervision. And that was back in the day. We don't do government supervision anymore. Unadulterated for pure, just for pure water, bottled at exactly 100 proof. And let's see, what else am I missing here? The label also had to identify the distillery, where it was distilled and bottled. And also, at the time when it first came out, they had to actually have that green wrap that you'll see, especially on old Dusties. There's a green wrap that goes over the cork. We don't do that now. When you see that, it's more ornamental, more marketing stuff. But back in the day, you actually had to have that green stamp. And it actually did have a mug of John Carlisle back in the day as well. So as the story goes, there's a couple more nuances. There was an insistence that a federal agent actually had to be on site and possibly live on the distillery grounds or right down the road, because he was the only other person that had keys to these bonded warehouses. And it's important to note, like, bonded warehousing was in existence prior to this Bottle and Bond Act. But it wasn't until 1897 where the government really stepped in and said, if you're going to put this on the label, it has to follow all of these laws and regulations. A side note, you can actually transport bonded liquid to a different bonded bottling plant and still maintain the designation. You actually see that on our OVERHOLT bonded neck label. This guy right here, you can actually see that you'll see two DSPs. And that is because we aged or we distilled in Clermont and we aged in Clermont, but we bottled in Frankfurt. So we have to be really tight on like where it was distilled, where it was bottled. Now, for a company like ours, where we have multiple distilling sites, Clermont, Boston, we've got the OGD Frankfurt site where we do most of our bottling. If we were to distill in Clermont and age in Frankfurt, we wouldn't be able to call it bonded because it's two different DSPs. So it does get a little tricky. But yeah, it's super cool to be able to have bonded out in the world and be able to have this kind of nice little whiskey enthusiast nugget that you can talk about.
Well, Bradford, that's great. Thanks. Well, I think it's time for us to jump into these whiskeys. What do you think, guys?
Oh, yeah, I'm thirsty.
Let's get to the good part, right?
Yeah, and I believe we're going to start with Old Tub. Travis, what are your thoughts on Old Tub? I mean, this is one of those like kind of in the secret, like if you were lucky enough to tour the distillery and you exit through the gift shop and you're able to pick up, the 375 of it. But yeah, and I applaud that you guys are now doing this as a limited edition, or is it going to stick around, or is it what?
There's never say never. It was released as a limited expression. There's been some talks about keeping it consistent, so fingers crossed. But yeah, there's nothing official that we can say to that on that point. But you never know. We might have it permanently out there for our lovers and fans of the brand.
Yeah, for those of us who aren't routinely on the bourbon trail, this is great to be able to try this Old Tub. So, couple background pieces of information. Of course, this is made by Jim Beam Distillery. And if you've ever, many of you have, I'm sure, enjoyed just Jim Beam with a wonderful white label, their 80 proof bourbon. This is actually going to be the same distillation. The difference being that now this is bottled in bond. So again, you're getting that minimum aging component. You're getting that being bottled at 100 proof. And then, of course, it's unfiltered as well. All of that adds up to a whiskey that should be a little bit fuller in body, a little bit more powerful in character. So let's jump into it. Yeah. Keith, what do you think? What are you getting on the nose?
It just smells like happiness. I mean, it just, and I love it because, and I got to be careful on how I say this. There is a lot of really fancy, pretty whiskeys out there. And I love that this is just kind of, it's a brown spirit, it's whiskey. I feel like if I walked into a saloon in the Wild West, like this is kind of like what I could drink. And I love that little bit kind of rustic edge around it. Mm-hmm. And it's a simple, easy thing to appreciate and enjoy. And also too, I kind of love the story that Old Tub started as basically kind of the gasoline or gas station model where people would actually show up at the distillery with their empty, jug and were able to pick up, some to take home. And then as Beam grew bigger, they actually started to bottle it. And then the perfect location of moving the distillery closer to the train tracks. And as that became an easier way to ship stuff, the brand grew. And I mean, Old Tub was with us till pretty much like the 1940s, correct, Bradford? Or when was the transition?
Yeah, so actually it actually fell out right before Prohibition. And there's some lore that the brand was actually sold during Prohibition, but was then later brought back into the Beam family fold and revitalized. So this brand was actually being produced, it really took off in around 1890, 1892 when James Beam and his brother William Park Beam took over leading the full operation. They actually named the distillery after this best-selling brand, Old Tub. And yes, as you mentioned, this brand is a reference to those large mash tubs that were mixed, cooled, and stirred by hand. But yeah, it was produced up until the distillery had to close down for prohibition, but then was brought back after that. But you know, in the early 1930s, it was Old Tub, and that's when also the Jim Beam brand was launched as well. So the Jim Beam brand really started to take off. But Old Tub has been around. It's been that quiet force in the background that's always been there. But we're just now starting to, as of 2020, like really getting it out there, getting that great story out to the public.
Cool.
Yeah, I love this
Travis,
whiskey in particular.
yeah.
I love this whiskey in particular because for me, this is what's great about so much American whiskey is it's something that you don't want to fuss over. It can be enjoyed almost any kind of ways. At this higher proof, I think I mentioned earlier, I love pouring this over some chipped ice and just drinking it cold on a hot day. For me, it's refreshing. It's got that great, got a bold flavor so that it's not overly watered down by the inclusion of a little extra water or ice. But again, it plays great in cocktails. And for me, this is the perfect product for a classic old-fashioned cocktail. Get a little bit of brown sugar, some good bitters, just a little squeeze of an orange peel, stir it with ice, and you've got the perfect summer cocktail.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, this is a one of a kind liquid. Do you want to give it a taste and see what we get on the palate? Yeah. That's like a warm hug. That's one of my favorites. That's good.
Yeah, but it's like that warm hug from like your uncle. Like it's still good, but you're like, oh, okay, that's a little, all right, okay, here we go.
Yeah, definitely.
But part of that to me is I think a little bit of that unfiltered nature. And Bradford, could you talk a little bit about that? Because you don't, coming from the wine world, we see like unfiltered, the whole natural wine, hippy dippy, natural movement. You don't see unfiltered that often in the whiskey world. So what is that implying, and what does it do?
So filtering as a lever, so to speak, of like when we produce whiskey is a really interesting side of the business. We could probably do a whole other session just on filtering. What the decision to go unfiltered, we wanted to bring back some authenticity and nostalgia, and that unfiltered was a common practice, was probably the main practice of whiskey production back in the day. It wasn't until much later when we started to see carbon filtration and chill filtration kind of coming into vogue for numerous reasons. Filtering is a good thing. You think of it like think if you have a stone that you want to polish, a little bit of filtering will reveal some really amazing nuances to the liquid. Unfiltered, especially with the liquid that we've got here today, we found that even at the unfiltered side of things, it just has so much to give that we felt that we didn't need to do any filtration on the liquid. And this also has that nice added bonus of being a bit more authentic and a bit more nostalgic to how it was produced back in the day.
Yeah, well, and I think that's a perfect segue into a really nostalgic kind of old label that a lot of us have seen probably our whole lives. And it's one of those ones that, I think even there's been like, some into, social settings, like, and I think like Looney Tunes even referred to it as like old overcoat.
I believe so,
yep. On one cartoon.
Yep.
So this is kind of a cool, fun thing. This Old Overholt is, longest running. What's the
Yeah,
in here?
Sure. So Overholt's a super cool brand, and it's part of the Beam Suntory family, as part of our legacy brands. And we're just super lucky to have a brand like this in our stable to be able to talk about. It's got a really, as you mentioned, it's got a really special heavyweight title belt. It is the longest continually maintained and produced whiskey brand in U.S. history, bar none. Hasn't missed a beat since 1810. So that's what now, 211 years now, if my math is right. And just like Beam and Bourbon, this iconic rye brand is able to be a cornerstone for the American whiskey canon in American rye. It's really interesting though that both families came to America and actually landed in the Philadelphia area in and around 1710. And there's some lore that the families could have been on the same boat called the Mary Hope, coming over from Germany. So if there was ever an American whiskey genesis story, it probably revolves around the Mary Hope ship. Overholt was started by a family with a long distilling heritage, spearheaded by a single guy, and that's Abe. He's the grumpy guy who takes his rye very seriously on the label. Maintained, expanded by family, and it grew into this amazing whiskey juggernaut through some pretty unique ownership under major figures in history, and then eventually landing under the expertise and stewardship of Beam Suntory back in the late 1980s when we acquired National Distillers. Ultimately, this brand really set the course and set the bar for American rye. Really integrated with U.S. history and the growth of American entrepreneurship. Very resilient, super gritty. It's got a great story of stubborn immigrants and pioneers. I always like to say, this story is as patriotic as apple pie and as American as the steel industry. You've got these renegade businessmen from Abraham Overholt, who was a Mennonite and founder, to his grandson and steel magnate Henry Clay Frick, to his business partner Andrew Mellon of Mellon Bank, to the industrialists of Seton Porter, to making it through Prohibition. It is a story that keeps going and going, and we're just super stoked to be able to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I just so many questions popping in my head because there's just so many little cool little nuggets on the way. And I mean, I guess first off, speaking of old Abe, and I got my bow tie on in respect.
Yep.
I'm curious, is the scowl because he's been trapped on that label for almost 200 years, or did he not did he get kicked out of the the balcony suite at the Muppets? Was he the third old grumpy dude?
Yeah,
that should have been in there.
That's a really interesting question, and we have the luxury of an embarrassment of riches of all these historical stuff connected to the brand, and it's all true stories, right? So there's some I've been digging through some historical references, and there's some talk written down from back in the day that he actually suffered pretty significantly from rheumatoid arthritis. And there's an old photo from 1865 that shows him actually kind of gripping his fist really tightly, and his frown was probably in connection to some pain, actually. But he was also a Mennonite. Pretty stoic people, very firm in very resolute in their convictions. But yeah, he's got this. He was very benevolent. He was very well respected in the community. He was a genuinely nice guy, by all records. It was just he's got this frown that was captured in a photograph from 1865, made its way onto the label in 1888, and it's been there ever since. Although in the 70s and 80s, you did start to see that frown start to come up a little bit into a little bit of a smirk. But with our revitalization in the last year or so, we're going to go back to the original Abe, right? And bring back that iconic portrait and his frown. Yeah.
Another point to me that was really fascinating in the story was going to his grandson, Henry Frick, and how they were able to survive Prohibition. And that was, if you could touch on that, I think it's kind of a cool little.
Yeah. So Henry Clay Frick was he actually learned a lot of his business skills under Abraham's tutelage, and he went off to college and came back and actually worked for Abraham at the store for many years, and then got distilling experience in business management from Abe, and then actually in March of 1881, actually he acquired the whole enterprise for $1 from the family, and after that, he brought on his business partner, Andrew Mellon, to diversify risk. There was also this kind of interesting character by the name of Charles Mock. We don't know a lot about Charles Mock, but there's three gentlemen who were leading the Overholt enterprise at that time. It was Charles Mock's decision actually to put on Abe's portrait to honor the founder on the label. And it was because of Andrew Mellon's connections as Secretary of Treasury under Warren Harding in 1920, he was actually able to negotiate and leverage. This guy had a tremendous amount of power. He had his fingers and hands in pretty much in a lot of business, and he basically was able to say, I want my company and my whiskey to be able to be bottled and sold during Prohibition. Give me a medicinal license, and it was because of Andrew Mellon that they were able to do that.
Yeah, well, and the fun little thing I found yesterday, kind of diving into the story, is maybe it's more well known, but that Andrew Mellon was the model for the Monopoly piece. of the top hat and the white mustache.
That's new.
If that
That's
is,
news to me. Yeah, but he was a
but it
pretty
actually
powerful
makes,
figure.
yeah. So now, like, I just wanted to like play Monopoly and drink Old Overholt, and
Yeah, there's also some great call outs with Andrew Mellon in the HBO special Boardwalk Empire.
yeah,
They actually bring up the Overholt distillery at the Bradford distillery in southwestern PA. It's a nice organic call out to the brand, and Andrew Mellon is speaking about the brand in the episodes. It's pretty cool.
well, very cool. Travis, shall we dive into this and taste? What do you pick up on the nose?
Yeah, let's get into it. So again, we have the benefit of tasting and smelling these side by side, but right away, that difference just between the two styles of whiskey is really apparent. This rye is showing a lot more spicy, grassy characteristics. I almost get this sort of, again, seeded rye kind of a lift to the nose with all those notes of vanilla, of baking spices, of caramel, those sort of signature notes of American oak. And this one, especially too, for me, rye is always really flamboyant on the nose too, where bourbon can sometimes be a little bit quieter and have more base notes. Rye whiskeys always have these really wonderful top notes that just leap out of the glass and have a lot more personality for me aromatically.
Can I steal that? I love the word flamboyant when it's attached to whiskey. So that's a great way to outline it.
It's all yours. Happy to share.
Yeah, and playing on that bass notes of, if that's corn is your bass, this is like the hi-hat, snare drum, and I think it actually translates even more to the palate, where I get this kind of snap to it. And what's really interesting is the mouthfeel is completely different than the old tub.
Yep.
And the old tub just seems more heavier, oilier, viscous, where this is just a little bit more sharp, focused, spicy, which is kind of
and there's almost this great
thing.
Texture that runs right down the center of your tongue that's different from the bourbon. That's a little I don't know, like you said, a little fuller, a little bit more oily. Talking about cocktails really quick, I mean, we mentioned the old fashioned with the old tub, and that's a great way to go. For me, the oldest recipes of old fashioned cocktails were commonly made with rye whiskey, because at that point rye was just more common in the United States. But then also for me now, I love a good Sazerac cocktail. And so Sazerac cocktail is just rinsing your rocks glass with a little bit of absinthe or herb saint, that very anisey kind of spirit. And then pouring in just a little bit of your rye whiskey with some Peychaud bitters, a little lemon peel, and enjoying it chilled down like that. And for me, it's one of those classic, especially New Orleans Southern cocktails that is just so wonderful with rye whiskey.
You're like, I have like two great whiskeys in front of me, and you're actually making me thirsty. So thank you, Bradford. Bradford, if you could touch a little bit, because I mean, so much of the history of this brand was Pennsylvania rye, and then with Beam purchasing, the rights in 1987, moving production to Kentucky, how have you guys walked the line to honoring that tradition, and then also moving into the future?
Yeah, so that's a great question. We're lucky enough to actually be part of a really unique evolution of American rye story, because we never missed a beat, because we never went defunct. For the majority of our period, it was a Monongahela style no corn rye mash bill, which is incredibly distinct. We start to see a little bit of resurgence on that, primarily from smaller producers out of Pennsylvania. And at the same time, we're super proud of our Kentucky rye style, which is a bit more corn heavy. So we actually call that out on the label. We have born in PA, made in Kentucky. And so we're actually able to embrace both of these styles. So we can talk about our heritage and our lineage in that Monongahela style, but we also have a very strong heritage and lineage in that Kentucky style as well. So yeah, it's a great part of the story, being able to talk about the nuances of American rye and what it's able to bring to drinkers across all different spectrums. Being able to have the ability to talk about what makes rye different than bourbon. Like, yeah, on a very surface level, we can just say it's a mash bill change. But if you really want to go deeper, you can get into those different styles of Monongahela. You've got Maryland style rye. You've even got, like, I think there's Empire rye is becoming a new thing coming out of New York. So we've got this energy about these different styles of rye starting to percolate. So being part of that conversation is super important to us.
Yeah. Well, to me, it's like I love that energy and all kind of this new kind of our exploring our history, but I also love that there is such a well-made, great kind of, you know, keystone that if you understand this, then it's easier to understand the rest.
Yeah, I mean
And
Overholt is, you know, was rye before we actually had rye, you know, before we were really starting. It's always been there. Yeah, and to be such an integral part of the story, and to be a keystone, like you say, is an honor to be involved where we are with the whole category.
yeah, well, and also I want to just tip the cap because the other aspect that we should talk a little bit more about is the fact that you can do like this bottled and bond, which is not I mean, it is kind of a limited expression, but still the fact that it's out there, it's not going to break the bank, and you can actually find it. You know, that's such a nice thing. So thank you, and please keep bringing us really good, high quality whiskeys at a great price that we can find.
And that is one of our mantras that for the Overholt brand. It's great quality whiskey in the bottle for an affordable price. That's a really strong point for us, especially moving forwards as well.
Yeah, I mean, Travis, how often have you had it to where you get kind of like the whiskey snobs in and they're like, but then you like put one of these in like a cocktail and then they're like blown away?
Oh, happens all the time. And I will say, like, that's one of the things that I love so much about American whiskeys is I'm an equal opportunity whiskey drinker. I love great Scotch, love great, you know, European whiskeys. But the great thing about American bourbon, American rye whiskeys, it's really an everyday luxury. And so for me, like having it as a daily part of life almost, or, for my weekly cocktail night or whatever, is just something that is affordable and that is always delicious and really just distinctive in style. And so I think it's a part of every whiskey lover's bar, even those of us who do like to shell out for those really expensive single malts.
Yeah.
Well, I think on that note, we should probably cheers and go mix ourselves some cocktails and, you know, take this bourbon time to the next level. So
yeah, it's happy hour somewhere.
Yeah, exactly. Bradford, thank you for joining us. Travis, always a treat to taste with you. Cheers, everyone.
Yeah, thanks. Cheers, everyone.
Great. Thank you.